Okay, we're welcome back to the Aleph-Bet Mishnah. I want to begin with our review. We're close to the end. Today we're going to begin looking with the Mishnah that begins with the letter Resh, which is relatively close to the end of the alphabet. Resh, Shin, Taf. That's it. There's only three. And then we're going to also, as part of our study the very last two Mishnahs in the Mishnah, the concluding Mishnayot of the Mishnah. Hello, Howard. We'll get to those next time, but I want to spend a little time going over all the stuff that we've done so far, because we've done Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, that's 10, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samech, Ayin, Pei, and Tzadi, and Kuf. That's almost 20. We've done 19 Mishnayot together. That's really quite incredible. That's a tremendous amount of material. And we've done it in small little pieces, which is the way the Mishnah is designed pedagogically. There's really not a lot of very long Mishnayot. So it's meant to be studied in small pieces like we've been doing. The first thing I want to review here is to go over this one last time, because by repeating, I hope to sink a lot of this stuff in. You should be able to see the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 Seders, orders of the Mishnah. Sometimes it's just called Shas, Shisha Sidrei. The first letters of those two words, Shin and Samech, is Shas. So if someone says to you, I'm studying Shas, what they mean is they're studying Mishnah or something based on the Mishnah, because it's a reference to the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders. There's Zra'im, Moed, Nashim, Nizikin, Kodashim, Taharot. And if you remember, I gave you a mnemonic device by which to remember them. Zman, the first letter of the first 3, Nakat, Zman, Nakat. We've studied from a lot of different Masechtot here, different volumes. We've studied from Barchot, we've studied Peah, we've studied Kilayim, we've studied Chala, we studied Shabbat, we studied Pesach, we studied Yoma, we're going to study Rosh Hashanah today. We studied from Ta'anit, we studied Bava Metzia, we studied Chulin. Over here, we studied Para and Machshirin, I believe. I mean, so we've been all over the place, really. And you can see the totality of Mishnah. Mishnah tries to be an all-encompassing effort to embody comprehensively Jewish knowledge. Okay, let's go back to our Mishnayot. Oh, gotta let Nikki in here. Okay, I'm gonna go all the way back up. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to roll through these kind of quickly to give a quick review of the different kinds of things that we've done. We began with Mishnah Brachot in a conversation about how to approach prayer and tefillah, what state of mind and what things we should and should not allow to be interruptions in our prayer. And
before you run through all of them.
Yes, sure, Cindy.
So other than it being alphabetical, was there some other kind of interlocking theme or idea that we're supposed to be picking up on, or they're as disjointed as I feel they are?
They are as disjointed as you feel they are in terms of their content. The things that are consistent throughout are the things which I've been trying to remind us of, which is what's the svara, what's the thinking behind the specific content that they're doing? Where are there leniencies and where are there stringencies? Who's being strict and why? Who's being lenient and why? What are the measures that they're concerned about? They're concerned about how long, how far, how much, right? All of those kinds of things. What are the measures? And where do we have disputes and disagreements, and what are the finer points about which they're disagreeing, right? It's not just he says A and he says B, but like, what are they really disagreeing about? So that's what I've been trying to draw as consistently throughout all of these things. And the reason that I do it this way is that it is kind of random or, arbitrary, right? It follows the alphabet, but we get to change subjects because I guess part of my underlying premise is the subject itself is not that important. I mean, it's important, right, but it's not the most important thing. The thinking, the internal logic, the underlying principles, that's what I'm really trying to get at. And by jumping around, I don't know, it's kind of like unstructured music. You're a little bit unbounded by, we're going to study Shabbat, right? We would understand Shabbat more deeply maybe. But this way, but if we got bored of it, we'd just be bored and we'd just keep studying something we're bored of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yes, I that I understand. I just was concerned that I was missing something on the content, but we're talking about a method of thinking, correct, that we can apply not just to the Mishnayot, but to life. Yes,
correct.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
In fact, that's ideal, right? I mean, the goal is not just to the Mishnayot. Yeah. Okay, we talked about the holiness of money and of property, and what we can and cannot do with property that we sell, and does morality inhere in money. We spoke about the issue of kashrut of the sciatic nerve and the sheath that surrounds it, and the stringencies that apply to it. We talked about the ancient structure of the rabbinic courts, and which courts required which numbers of judges. Several places we talked about issues of brachot, blessings for different kinds of things, and when you do and don't say certain kinds of blessings, including things for miracles and idol worship, things like that. We talked about several agricultural laws and things that allow you to divide up and understand your agricultural requirements, like what divides the corner of the field. We talked about several issues in tahara and tum'ah, of purities and impurities, and how the condensation in caves and human sweat and different kinds of water that are, this was another thing, Cindy, that I always tried to show, is to use envelope pushing examples. I want to try to really push the variables as far as I can so that I can sort of understand the boundaries and the parameters of how far the law gets applied. Do we apply the law broadly or narrowly? Do we think about how to apply something broadly or narrowly? We talked about a couple of laws of Shabbat and about how so much of the Mishnah's concerns about Shabbat seem to be concerned with technology and mechanical fulfillment or breaking of the law, including this one here about a broken cask and how much you can or cannot sponge up or collect out of a cask that's been broken. We referenced several things about Yom Kippur, including the ancient scapegoating ritual, in which lots are drawn and one is placed on one goat and one is placed on the other. We also talked about the principal prohibitions of Yom Kippur: eating, drinking, washing, clothing, and sexual relations, and a couple of exemptions. We talked about the basic blessings that we say over foods and identified that bread and wine have unique place in Jewish history and theology and thinking about blessings and how we bless our food. We talked about property rights and property responsibilities and how close you can and cannot be to your neighbor's property before you start to have impact on their property, and what the rules are for things that might be caustic or toxic to somebody else, how you have to deal with them. We talked about the reading of the Shema and the hours and the different hours that things are required, and how mitzvot that are for the nighttime can be done for the whole of the night, even though it's better to do them earlier in the night. We talked about building fences and keeping, far away from sin, and how that could be translated and applied into our life. We talked about the specific laws of carrying Shabbat, and the one interesting instance of you're carrying something that's permitted to carry on Shabbat, but that thing has something that's not permitted to be carried on Shabbat inside of it. He's either holding it in the child or in a basket, something like that, and what the different points of view were on carrying on Shabbat. We talked about the Monday, Thursday, Monday fasts. We talked about Erev Pesach and two central obligations that are on everybody. We talked about import and export of produce in and out of the land of Israel, and whether or not challah is required. And we drew that 4-part box where A, B, B, A, right? All the different permutations that could be done on where it's grown and where it's eaten. Again, we talked a little bit here about the tuma and tahara in the case of the red heifer and the water that was prepared from the ashes of the red heifer, and whether small amounts of different things fell into that water, how you would mitigate it in order to make sure that the tahara was done correctly. And I think this was our last one, was we talked about an intentionally bald or left empty spot within a vineyard, and the laws of kilaim, of mixed agricultural planting, and what you weren't and weren't allowed to do. We saw a classic dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, where, as usual, Beit Shammai has the more stringent opinion, and the halacha follows Beit Hillel and the more lenient and open opinion. Woo! That's good, right? I really do want you to just pause for a moment, especially those of you all who've been here for more than just 1 or 2 sessions. Like, that's a lot of material, right? I mean, it's tremendous. And I hope you feel scholarly. You should. It's a scholarly achievement to study through that much of something ancient. These passages, this material was written and edited, 2 millennia ago. And we're accessing very ancient conversations and participating in them. And to me, that's just incredible. And it does require, a certain amount of, okay, we got to learn the terms and the terminologies and the structures and the background. And, we're not just, it's not just white belts, right? We're sort of advancing our way up the hierarchy of understanding and learning. And really, that is my ultimate goal, is for you to feel empowered by the resource and the sources of Jewish wisdom. We have a tremendous heritage, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, hang on, I'm going to close this door 1 second.
Barbara, are you busy taking notes?
I always take notes. If he had asked, what did we talk about? I could have told him.
Great, it's great.
Good for you.
I color code them too.
Oh my goodness gracious.
There is, it's not just good to take notes, to have a record of what we talked about too. It directly aids in the learning process itself, to connect hand and brain, right? I mean, there's so much there between what you do with your hands and what happens in your brain.
Would you please come lecture to my class on that?
Oh man, I would. I'd love it. Yeah. Look, the whole prayer beads, right? All that stuff, fidgets, things musicians and athletes do to access deeper transfer side of your brain kind of thinking. It's all in your hands. Okay. So let's jump into our new material. Now, to understand this Mishnah, we have to understand a little bit about how the ancients understood the calendar, how they structured it, and how they knew what day it was. When we want to know what day it is, we look in the calendar. Most of us would look on our phone, and or before that, you would have had a calendar, and you may have even had like some kind of, device to help you track exactly what day it was. I mean, there were people who, that was sort of their job, was to know what day it was. And most people knew más o menos where it was within the calendar, because if you go outside, you can look up in the sky and you can see how big is the moon. Is it waxing or waning? And people didn't have electricity, so they didn't have light pollution. They lived in nature more than we do, and they saw the moon every day. So it's almost Rosh Chodesh. Right? It was easy to know when the new moon is within a day or two. But to know exactly, if you're not counting, you might be off by a day or so. And let's keep in mind that the Hebrew, so let me take even a bigger step back. How many days in a year?
365.
365 and change, and a quarter, right? And what does that mean? That means that we're going around the sun, and we go all the way around in a year, right? It takes 365 days. So that's the amount of time that it takes our little sphere to fly around the bigger sphere and to get back to the exact same point in space, right? And we only have to adjust it once every 4 years. If we didn't adjust it every 4 years, what would happen is slowly over time, January would be in the summertime, right? The day would start to migrate. Every 4 years, you'd go off by a day. And in cosmic time, every 4 years is a very small amount of time, right? 4 million years, you're off by, a million days. So you can't have that and have things fall basically in the same time of year. That's why we have leap year. Now, on the lunar calendar, how many days in a cycle? Barbara?
Either 27 or 29, depending on what you're basing it on.
You're close, but not quite.
No, maybe it's the ancient Jews that are close, but not exact.
No. I understand where you're going. But in the lunar cycle, for the moon to be back in the same place vis-a-vis us does not take 365 days. It takes 354 days and change. So the Muslim calendar, for example, takes a 354-day calendar and does not alter it, what's called intercalation, to put into the calendar a leap day of some kind. And so you have the phenomenon where their holidays migrate through the seasonal year, right? That's why Ramadan is not always in the summertime. It's constantly moving around throughout the seasons of the year because they're off from the solar calendar by about 11 days every year. It doesn't take many years for your holiday to move significantly in the seasons. The Jewish calendar, which was not exclusively a Jewish calendar, but the ancient lunar calendar is a 19-year cycle, and it includes 7 years in which there is intercalation. 19-year cycle, 7 years where there is intercalation. And what that means, intercalation means two things in the Hebrew calendar. One, there's a whole other month added, which we're in right now, right? The Adar. Eventually, you need to add a lot of time to keep it in the same season. You can't just add a day every 4 years. That's not going to cut it when the difference is 11 days. So 7 out of every 19 years, you add an entire month to the calendar. It's always the same month. It's always Adar, and it's always added, directly before Pesach, the month before Pesach. So that Purim is always 4 weeks before Pesach, never 6 weeks before Pesach or 8 weeks before Pesach. Okay. Now, the other thing is sometimes days are 29, sometimes months are 29 days, and sometimes they are 30 days. Some months are always 29, some months are always 30, and some months, depending on the year that we are in the cycle, can be either 29 or 30 days. Now, all that is totally confusing, and you do not need to remember it. All you really need to understand from that is that there was a complicated set of intercalations, which they did, in order to keep the holidays where they were supposed to be, all that kind of stuff, and to have the year and the calendar work correctly, and that they had it figured out, right? This was not
I won't say the rabbi's wrong. The rabbi and the ancient Jews were using a different system.
Yeah, no, I understand that. That's there's arguably advantages.
Well, they weren't astrophysicists of, with today's
right.
telescopes. And
People had things like astrolabes, right? Like where you could look at stars and know where you were on the earth based on if you knew the date and the stars, you could know where you were. Or if you knew any of those two, you would know the third. But that's very complicated stuff. I mean, you have to have charts and things and know how to use the instruments. It's like you have to be an astrophysicist, an ancient astrophysicist.
Well, even a modern astrophysicist, because my son Yoni is putting in a grant application for some James Webb telescope time, and he has to put it in for a specific day because he wants to be able to see a specific star, which is going to be visible in the northern hemisphere. And, that's complicated. So, but you have to know the specifics.
Right, you have to know what you're looking for to see it.
Yeah.
Okay. But we're more interested in the moon and its cycles. We need to know when Rosh Chodesh is. Why do we need to know when Rosh Chodesh is? Not so that we get the day of Rosh Chodesh correct. We need to know when Rosh Chodesh is so that we get the day of Passover and Sukkot correct. Right? We need to know when the full moon is. And in order to know when the full moon is, you kind of have to know when the new moon is. You start counting from the new moon, and then 14 days later, you have, halfway through onto the night of the 15th. That's like Pesach and Sukkot. And you can get to Shavuot because you're counting 7 weekly cycles from Passover to Shavuot. So if you know when Rosh Chodesh Nisan is, you will celebrate Passover on the correct days, and you will celebrate Shavuot on the correct days. If you don't know, you might eat chametz on Passover. You might think it's the last day you could eat chametz, but it's actually the first day of Passover. Or you might end Passover early. You might think Passover is over and eat chametz. But it's not over for another day, and you ate chametz on Pesach. So that's very bad, obviously. So you need to know when Rosh Chodesh is. And here's how they would do it. They would light signal fires. There was the new moon was declared at a central place in Jerusalem. There were hired professionals whose job it was to watch the skies and know what was going on, and to see the new moon and to declare it. And then that would be, boom, that's the new moon. Is it the 29th day or the 30th day? It's the 30th. This is the new moon. It's the first of the next month. And then they would light a signal fire. And there would be a series of signal fires lit all up and down the spine of the land of Israel. So that within a matter of minutes, really, you can notify everybody in the whole country, it's the new moon, and start counting. Pesach is just 2 cycles of the sun away. Okay, now let's look at this Mishnah. Ra'uhu Beit Din v'chol Yisrael. If the Beit Din and everybody else, all of Israel, saw the new moon, or if the examination of witnesses, meaning witnesses came to this court, to this Beit Din, and said, we saw the moon, and they, grilled them, they asked them, they examined the witnesses, but it had become too dark. It had become dark before they declared the new moon. Said Mikudash. The new moon is Mikudash. It's declared. The month will be intercalary, which means there will be a 30th day. When the Beit Din alone saw it, 2 of its members must stand up before the others as witnesses, who shall then say, because everything takes 2 witnesses, so 2 of the people on the Beit Din separate themselves out from the court, sort of a recusal, and they say, we're now witnesses before the court. We say Mekudash, we saw the new moon. That, of course, assumes that you have to have more than 3 people on your court, because if you take 2 out, there's only 1. You can't have 1 left on the court. So when only 3 are forming that Beit Din have seen it, 2 of them must stand up as witness and conjoin some other of the learned associates with the single one, sort of like deputize one of the front row law students. That's what they mean. that there would be people in the court who were, studying to be judges. And you would temporarily appoint one of them to be the Beit Din with the single one, and then they could give their evidence to say Mekudash, because a single member of the Beit Din cannot do this by himself. Did you follow the numbers acrobatics there a little bit? In other words, if your court, you need to have both judges and witnesses, sufficient number of judges and a sufficient number of witnesses. What if we have enough for one, right? We have enough for one, but we don't have enough for both to have two. Well, you kind of, you make a posse. You deputize an agent temporarily to simply receive the expert testimony and to be the second name on the document. You declare Mekudash, the moon is seen, and then you don't add the 30th day. That means the next day is one of the next month, is Rosh Chodesh. Not, well, nobody saw it yet, so we're adding the 30th day. Right? It was a little more hands-on. Now, historically, here's what happens. It's kind of an interesting thing, and it's part of why we do 2 days of Yom Tov. It's connected with this. Why 2 days of Yom Tov? The Mishnah doesn't say 2 days. The Bible doesn't say 2 days. And you would think, if I could successfully tell you when Rosh Chodesh was, then everybody in the whole country will know when Pesach is, and we'll have no problem. Here's the problem, is just like today, back then, people were jerks, and they sought to undermine one another in order to gain political and socioeconomic advantage against each other. And even to gain cultural and theological advantage one over the other. And so you have a sectarian battle in first century Judea, where the Sanhedrin, the centralized court, the Sadducees and Pharisees, who represent the majority of the population at the time, are all there in Jerusalem operating on this calendar. And then you have a group of sectarians who want to mess with the system. So what do? They light their own fires. They mess with the signal. Even before the court declares and lights their big central signal fire, one of these other sects lights a signal fire, sets off the whole chain of signals, and now the whole system is chaotic. So they actually, the sources record a change in the practice from lighting signal fires to sending messengers, by horse or donkey or something. And now from the central court, you send messengers out in every direction. When everybody is living in Eretz Yisrael, you can reach everybody in a day or two by horse. You can go from all the way down south in Judea, in Benjamin and Judah's tribe holdings, down to Beersheba, right, all the way in the south, all the way up to Dan in the north and the northern border with Lebanon in a couple days. I mean, you can walk that in a week. So it's not that hard to deliver the message. I mean, it's harder than the signal fires, but it's still effective. And so so long as everybody lives within the confines of the land of Israel, you don't really have much of a problem. But what happens when Jews live in Spain and Babylonia? That's far. You got to go a long way to get from Jerusalem to Iraq, your messenger, you can't do it. You can't get a messenger there, certainly not in time, predictably, in every direction, all the way up to Ashkenaz and all the way out to Sepharad and all the way out to past Arabia. Now you got Jews everywhere, the diaspora. And so the rule becomes 2 days in the diaspora to allow a buffer. This way, I have 2 days at the beginning of Pesach and 2 days at the end of Pesach. I basically have a sliding set of parameters that, because I'll never be more than a day off, right? I could be a day off, but it's always just a day. Is it the 30th or is it the 1st? We don't know. We're waiting for the court to make that nuanced decision. But once it's the 1st, everybody knows it's the 1st. So if I say today's the 1st, but it was actually tomorrow, no problem. All I did was not eat chametz on one additional day. That's not a problem. I ate what I thought was the first day of Pesach, wasn't. I did the second day, that was my first day. And then the end days, I had enough days. So you're no longer dependent upon the signal fires and really no longer dependent upon the horse and messenger riders. And you're protected in the diaspora by simply adding an additional day to the 3 major holidays that are contingent upon Rosh Chodesh, but don't occur on Rosh Chodesh, namely Rosh Hashanah, which is 2 days for a different reason. Yeah, Howard, you're muted. You got to unmute. I can't hear you.
Got me. So one of the groups, the main group that was lighting those fires, as I understand, were the Samaritans,
Correct.
and they were not the good Samaritans. Those were the bad Samaritans.
Right. The truth is, all of those sects were not the good guys. It was a time of deep sectarian divisions. We like to identify with the Pharisees because the rabbis were Pharisaic, but not everything the Pharisees did was good. I mean, they're not always like, yeah, Pharisees are always the best, go Bears. No, it's not like that, right? I mean, like, there was widespread zealotry in each of these groups, and Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites. He said, "You're hypocrites. Alas for you." He was like, "Woe unto you, you people who completely." He said, "You completely misunderstand everything." No, not. It's obviously not my personal position, but I do understand it, and I'm not, so narrow-minded that I can't understand that my group might also have had my group. I'm not a Pharisee, right? I mean, they lived a long time ago. I'm an inheritor, a partial inheritor of that tradition. But none of those groups were really free of blame for the deep divisions that existed then. Yeah, see, that was the same. It's true today too, right? Again, maybe we can see the savara, maybe we can see the thinking that underlies some of their stuff. Like they struggle with many of the same issues that we do. Is what do you do when there's deep social divisions that not only divide you along ideological things, but that actually start to interrupt with civilization and the effective functioning of society, so that like literally everyone's on the same day. We have that same problem. And interestingly enough, I remember learning that since there's now all this legislation about daylight savings time and all that stuff, that's, it seems like that always sort of, it's perennial. But not everybody switches daylight savings time. And in some places, it's kind of like a political thing as to when you do or don't. And I remember learning that the Israeli Knesset and the Palestinian Authority change to daylight savings on different days. They are literally neighbors, and you can't tell me when to change. Well, you're going to change on that day. We'll change on the other day. I'm afraid that is how overly simplistic and foolish the decision making was. If you control the calendar, if you control time, if you can tell people what day it is and what time it is and where to be and when, that's a measure of cultural and social control, and people still want to be able to exercise that. We have to talk about, of course, what about today with 2 days of Yom Tov, right? This, our particular Mishnah doesn't really care about 2 days of Yom Tov. This here is really just interested in a very, very small piece of the internal workings of the calendar agency bureaucracy, as it were, right? There was a centralized bureaucracy, and this gives us a window into how it may have worked. And we know from other places in Rosh Hashanah and elsewhere about many of the other things that changed. My question is about the 2 days of Yom Tov, because we know what day it is. I mean, we know better than they know, than they knew, way better. We know with incredible precision. It's very easy for everyone, everywhere. Our horse and messengers are super efficient. And notification, I mean, I don't know when Rosh Chodesh is, but I'm notified about when Rosh Chodesh is on my wrist, wherever I am in the whole world. And that's not to say, wow, technology is great and ancient people were dumb. No, they figured it all out just by looking up at the sky. I mean, they had a lot of understanding and wisdom about the way the world works. But we know some things that they didn't know, including what day it is. And we know that without there's no question. In fact, because there are now Jews living in the land of Israel, significant number of Jews living in the land of Israel, we have a phenomenon where by sticking with the old way, Jews who live outside the land of Israel are celebrating holidays on different days than Jews who live inside the land of Israel. When we all know, like I know that my cousins in Israel are eating chametz while I'm on the last day of Passover. What? How is that possible? So I don't know, you probably heard me talk about it here, what we're doing at Shul this year in going and being sort of, at least in some ways, a one-day Yom Tov synagogue. And the conservative movement, the law committee, did discuss it in the 1950s and passed permissive tshuvot in the 50s, saying it's not necessary to keep 2 days of Yom Tov. And synagogues and rabbis have the option of what's basically following the Israeli calendar. Reading Torah on the same cycle as them, having 1 day of Seder, 1 day of Shavuot, 1 day at the end of Pesach, 7 days of Sukkot, not 8, etc., etc. Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeret on the same day. But even till this day, a very small minority of conservative shuls do 1 day of Yom Tov. Like we could probably count them on one, possibly two hands. I might be off on that, but I don't think by far. It's really not many.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's a couple of things, Suzanne. I think part of it is we believe, not we, I will say, many people believe in the slippery slope. That if we don't hold this line, we're going to slip. And then we're going to let another line go and slip further and let another line go and slip further. There is, the slippery slope is a reality. We all know that can happen. But I personally think it's very seriously overplayed. And let's not forget that there is a second slope on the other side that slips towards more strict, right? Well, let's just be a little more strict. Well, if we're a little more strict, let's be a little more strict. Well, if we'll only eat glot, let's only eat super glot, right? And in fact, let's only eat super glot by a certain group of people. Well, wait a minute. I thought kosher was kosher. I mean, you're going to slip down that, that's also a slope. So I don't place a lot of merit in that. And I also think, but people hold on to traditional practice, and they do have that feeling like it's I call it like the Marines feeling, right? Like I'm tough, right? I do 2 days, right? I like show up for all of that, and I get that feeling. I mean, it's a very gratifying feeling to know that you hold down, an arduous task. That's good. I think there's some there's some concern about what will the Orthodox say. They'll say, see, we told you, they're just like the Reform. They're not any different than the Reform. They're exactly the same, and see, we told you, right? They're worried, they're worried about what the guys to the right are going to say. I think all those things play into it. And I think all of that, none of that is really too critical. The compelling thing for me is everybody in Israel lives that way. So we cannot say that it is not okay to celebrate the way that half the Jews in the world celebrate, right? So it is okay. The question is, will we do it? Is there a compelling reason for us to continue to do this minhag, this custom, this way? Is there something that it does actually give us? And I have found no. The answer is no, it really doesn't. The second day of Yontif in shul is like 8 people. I mean, it's a really small, tight group of people. It's always the same group of people, and even they don't really want to be there. So no, it doesn't really give us that. It requires part of our communal resources. There's only so much goodwill and time that the members of a given place have to give to that place, and you're asking them for 6 or 7 hours more every couple of weeks, 3 times a year. And when I think it's a lot like some other things where when we know that the ancients' way is not necessary, right? This is not a judgment of them to say they didn't know the movement of the calendar and have satellites. That's not judgmental. It's just true. We just do know more. I mean, I read from a book. They didn't have books, but I read from a book. Sometimes progress is actually progress. And to stand against it and demand some blind, not adherence to tradition, a blind adherence to tradition, when you know the reason is not valid any longer, I think actually undermines your authenticity. I think that's an undermining element of orthodoxy, not a reinforcing one. It's part of the reason why I'm not Orthodox, because they have a blind obedience to this stuff. So I find that liberating and actually empowering to be more dedicated. And if you want, the one disadvantage I will say is one Seder, not 2. So you want to have 2 seders?
Look, we
Have 2 seders. There's nothing stopping you from having 3 seders, right? Have a seder on Chol HaMoed. That's totally allowed, right? Have 3. Invite your neighbors to the 4th one. I mean, like, okay, right? Develop the custom. Don't dig into this one particular place, driven by a set of circumstances that do not exist.
Rabbi Norry, one interesting thing that happened this year going to one day is on Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeret. And I think you know this, there were people who were saying, this service was way too long. So one of the things I feel like, because it's combined and there were complaints, who's going to sit here? And I'm like, well, you just saved us 3 hours tomorrow. So
Right.
take extra, but I don't know that they went second day, but that was kind of an interesting side effect that I didn't expect to hear about. But for me personally, I feel like part of the issue too is that we aren't celebrating Sukkot and Simchat Torah enough on the first day. So I feel like one obligation on us if we go to one day is like Purim last night. We need to make sure these are festivals that people commit to, because then I feel like it's not that you've lost the second day, it's that we're adding back a first day that's like losing observance.
Right. And when the issue came before the law committee, that was part of what people talked about. And they said, if you go this way, we're also telling you that you should look for ways to make that day meaningful for people, even though it is not a Yom Tov and restricted in work, et cetera, et cetera. That
I don't even mean that second day though. I mean the actual Yom Tov day. I
Right.
feel like first day, even if we go to one day Sukkot or Simchat Torah, we don't have the crowds that I feel like you should have a reward for the one day, and that's more people and more willingness to celebrate.
I agree, and I think what I think has changed in my lifetime, and I think it's really not a good change, is an attitude that parents have towards school and school attendance. Your kids can miss school. It doesn't matter. I am pro education. I have 20 plus years of formal schooling. I'm not against education, but my mom said, and she quoted Mark Twain, don't let school get in the way of your education. Mm-hmm. You also get educated by being in shul on Yom Tov, whether it's a weekday or not. People should, and I want to say your kids can miss school and you can miss work. Maybe not every day of the Yom Tovim, but some of them. And it's a shift in, I don't know, I think it's a very broad cultural kind of shift, and but we were not in school on any Yom Tov day, and we were not Orthodox. But you didn't go to school, and you didn't go to work on Yom Tov. And by the way, you didn't have to go, our rule in our house was you didn't have to go both days of Yom Tov to shul. If you went the first day of Yom Tov, you didn't have to go back the second day of Yom Tov. But if you didn't go the first day, you definitely go in the second day. Right? Like you couldn't just blow off school and not go to shul. Right? The reason you didn't go to school was so that you could be a part of this experience, at least one of those days. And then, your friends come over and you hang out and you play basketball, and there's a reward for celebrating and learning the Jewish way. And I think we're so obsessed with school and with grades and getting into the good college and having all that good stuff, like, teachers hassle kids, you get marks against you for unexcused absences. I hate all that. I hate all of it. I'm a grumpy old man about that.
Which is a
Yeah,
good
Barbara.
reason to send your children to the Jewish day school. We
That's
never
right.
had three of us here.
That's
the
right.
Bierman's grandkids, or I don't know if the school even existed when their kids were that age, but Shira, me, I mean, we never had that problem. Our kids
Right.
could miss. Well, our kids had no school those days, but other things like my kids would go to Minion, no problem with being late. So
Right. Yeah.
Although high school they didn't have, and that's hard now.
in high school,
High
Yeah.
school with that
Yeah.
high school.
Right. I had the same
I
thing. I
think
went,
we
I
did it
went
in
to a
high
day
school.
school through 7th grade, and then I went to public school for high school.
yeah, I don't remember when my daughter was at Springs what she did, but I always remember my son, who was downtown at the School of Fine Arts. He would go half a day. He would like go to services, have lunch, and go. Well,
Go for the end. Right.
and go for the afternoon.
Yeah, it is a case for day school education because it's an educational experience that is in harmony with the Jewish experience. I mean, there's other reasons too, but in this point of view, the more harmonious the path, the easier it is. When things are divergent and when this is happening at school, but you need to be over here, that's when there's a little bit of that conflict. Though I have to say, I think some of that conflict is okay. Like, yeah, you have to choose sometimes about what you go to, what you don't go to, how you prioritize your life. And the day, when the day school kids and the kids who stayed home from non-day school got together on Yom Tov. Come on over. We're playing basketball. We're swimming. We're eating together. We're sharing community, building that kind of stuff. And that's way more important than Wednesday's lesson on, the French Revolution. You'll get that. I mean, there's our children and our grown-ups, by the way, too. I'm including grown-ups in this. Are not at risk for not being professionally successful or academically successful. If they're at risk for a nutritional impoverishment, it's in their spiritual life. My 2 cents. Yeah, Mickey, we can't hear you though. You got to unmute.
Are you saying that for the balance of 2022, that we're observing only one day of the holiday? Well, I don't want to put one day of the holiday, but
Right.
so Yom Tov just one day for the rest of the year?
No, that is not what I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying that for Pesach and Shavuot,
Only. Mhm.
right? It's a 1-year suspension of practice. If you all decide to continue in that direction and to do that and to make that your practice, I say matov. I would not be upset by that, but I'm not, I'm not here to overturn standing practice. That's not my role.
Okay.
And in fact, I think because of the way the secular calendar falls at the end of Pesach, we're kind of actually going to do the end of Pesach a little more traditionally to piggyback Yisker onto the Shabbat morning service. Instead of a Friday morning service would be Yisker, and then that next day would be Chol HaMoed, Shabbat Chol HaMoed after Pesach. We're going to have we're going to do 2 days of Yom Tov. The Friday will be Yom Tov, and Saturday will be Yom Tov, the last day of Pesach, and that Saturday will be Yisker.
Going back to the whether to change the calendar or not to change the calendar, flip it back, flip it here. When Stanley was in service, he was stationed at Redstone Arsenal, which is like a suburb of Huntsville.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So White Plains was the other place that Redstone Arsenal had to keep in close contact with. So Redstone Arsenal was on the same time as White Sands. The city of Huntsville was not. So if you went into the city from 2 miles, you on a different time frame. It was crazy. So I'm for doing away with it.
That is great. I love that story. I have a similar experience at summer camp, because summer camps will often go back onto standard time at the beginning of camp, so that it is dark earlier, so that younger kids will go to bed earlier and get up early, right? I mean, that actually works for them better. So, camp, you'll come up to work at summer camp and everything will be nice. And then there'll be a big ceremony at the beginning of camp where they turn the clock back an hour. And that way Shabbos ends also an hour earlier, right?
Yeah.
For religious Jews, daylight savings has all kinds of problems. But at Ramah in Wisconsin, you're all the way up in northern Wisconsin, very close to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, right? And Wisconsin and Michigan are on different time zones, so by an hour. So the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is on Michigan's time zone, East Coast, and Wisconsin is on Central Time. But camp was on camp time.
Yeah.
So if you were planning to go to the Upper Peninsula, right, from camp on your day off, you had to leave like 2 hours early.
Exactly what we
You get up there in time to, do something at 9 or 10 o'clock in the Upper Peninsula, even though it was only 20, 30 minutes away. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Is it lunch yet?
I have another quick question that's related. One is on with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the sectarian groups. It kind of surprises me that they would purposely set fires earlier. Like, I get the idea of cultural control, but it seems like for all of them, it would be very central, like when Passover starts. So was it really just control, or did they have other views, like with the Greek Orthodox having Easter closer to Passover? Like, were they doing something different, or they just were doing specifically for control?
It was my understanding is it's primarily about arguments over rabbinic law over Torah law, right? Do you accept the oral law, the rabbinic, the Mishnaic doctrines, or do you just, follow the written law? Like the argument with the I'm blanking on the name, the Karaites or the Kutians. There were a number of sects who accept, mitzvot, but not the rabbinic mitzvot, of which there are many.
So starting Passover when we start is more on the rabbinic tradition compared to
that and the whole mechanism for the declaration of Rosh Chodesh.
Oh, okay.
Right, the need for a judge and a court to declare Rosh Chodesh and the intercalation.
So they just didn't want to buy into that system.
Right. There are people who were like, no, we don't do that.
Yeah. And then on the idea of second day too, I was thinking another issue is like, you don't want to start Passover day or early or late or whatever, but also if you're doing it a day early, and I'm sure some of the rabbis discuss this, you're eating matzah before Passover's really started, which I don't think is supposed to be
right. Which you're really right, which we learned in this class, you're not supposed to do on the eve of Pesach, you're not supposed to eat matzah. But that is,
I thought from Purim, you're supposed to not. Is that not right?
That's correct. That's correct. From Purim, you're not supposed to. Well, I was crossing in not eating chametz.
Right.
Right. Even before Pesach starts, you're supposed to not eat. you're right. It would be bad to eat matzah early, but it's not nearly as grievous a avera as eating chametz on Pesach.
Oh, got it.
Right? It's just, okay, now, your matzah experience was not ideal. You should, the first time you eat matzah, you should want it and eat it hungry and not have had it recently and not think of it as an ordinary food that you might have had last week, right? It's supposed to be l'shem mitzvah, for the purpose of the mitzvah, to eat the matzah. So you didn't do it ideally, right? Because you had some the day before. But chametz on Pesach is, you're liable for excommunication. You're chayav karet for eating chametz on Pesach. That's really bad. In the Torah's mindset, that separates you from the Jewish people.
Got it. So better safe than
Right.
sorry.
We don't do this. You do this, you have chosen out of this, practice. The matzah thing is not good, but it's not nearly as bad.
That's what I wanted to know.
Excellent. Anybody else?
I was just going to comment, you made this point, but not specifically. As a kid, I always thought that the reason we celebrated 2 days is because our dining room table was too small to handle friends and family in the same meal. And also it gave us an opportunity to have 2 different great menus.
Yes.
Now that we live in Birmingham and don't have family around, we could go back to just having the one with friends and be fine. But tradition is also respected, and tradition is the 2 meals and the 2 menus.
Right. It's I do not mean to suggest that tradition should be discarded casually.
Yeah.
When our kids were young and I was in long-term rabbinic work, we'd always have a big Seder on the first night. We'd invite a whole bunch of people. I always invited people who were converting with me to our Seder. My in-laws always came in for our Seders. We had just a big giant table of people on the first night. And then, I'm working the next morning and the next morning. So our second night Seder was always just us and the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And we basically let the kids run the Seder. They had to put up with all of my stuff on the first night. So on the second night, we were like, okay, what do you guys want to do? And in whatever order they wanted to do the different pieces of the Seder, we just did them until they ran out of steam, and then we had dinner. And, they would jump around. Let's do the 4 questions first. So we'd do the 4 questions first, and then we'd eat the karpas, and then we'd do something else, right? We just jump back and forth in the out of order Seder kind of thing. Which was really wonderful. We had some really, really nice moments with our kids, just having that second Seder, but not trying to repeat what we had done the previous night in any way. Yeah. And I do remember my mom specifically making 2 very distinct different menus, one for one night and one for the other. And looking forward to those 2 different menus, I want both of these meals. I really want them both, right? Chicken one night, roasted chicken one night, and short ribs the other night. That was, oh my God.
Heartburn.
Oh my God, yeah, exactly. It's good as a memory. The memory doesn't cause any heartburn, Mickey.